People like him don't belong here.
We have every right to be here.
My son has a first-class ticket. Renata! She belongs here more than anyone. Return to your seat.
Racist passenger demands a black boy leave first class. Then the pilot recognizes his mother. Act 1. The moment everything stops. A voice in the aisle, a face that changes everything. The man is already standing. That is the first thing. He has risen from his seat in row 2 of the first-class cabin of Flight 884 from Houston to Chicago, and he is standing in the aisle with the particular posture of a man who has decided that he is owed something and intends to collect it. He is broad-shouldered, and he is red-faced, and his voice has reached the volume where people 4 rows back have stopped whatever they were doing to look, because that volume, sharp and carrying and undercut with the conviction of someone who has never in their life been told they were wrong, is the kind of volume that commands attention whether or not you want to give it. He is pointing. He is pointing at a boy in seat 2C. The boy is 10 years old and his name is Tobias, and he is wearing a blue polo shirt that his mother buttoned for him at 6:30 this morning, and he is sitting with his hands in his lap and his eyes forward, and he is very, very still. Not the stillness of someone who is calm. The stillness of someone who has been taught stillness as a response to this specific kind of moment, taught it deliberately, practically, because the person who taught him understood that the moment would come, in some form, at some point, and that the correct response was not to flinch and not to argue, and not to give the thing being directed at you anything it can use. The man, his name is Donald Price, and he is 51 years old, and he is a commercial real estate developer from the Houston suburbs who flies first class 17 times a year, is saying he needs to move. He is saying it to the flight attendant who has arrived in the aisle, a young woman named Lindsay, who has been working this route for 2 years and who is managing her own face with great effort. He is saying it with the full weight of his conviction, which is considerable and which has never, in 51 years, been seriously contested. He is saying, I don't know how this happened, but this is not right. This is first class. People like him don't belong here. 5 words that contain an entire architecture of assumption, an entire history of deciding, before evidence has been gathered, before a word has been exchanged, before a single verifiable fact has been established, deciding, from the raw material of a boy's appearance, what he deserves and where he belongs, and what the appropriate response to his presence is. People like him don't belong here. The first-class cabin has gone very quiet. 8 passengers in the forward section, each of them in possession of a ticket that cost them what it cost, each of them settled into the cushioned, wide-seated, real glassware world of premium flying, and every single one of them has stopped what they were doing and is watching. Watching because they can't not. Because the volume has made looking away impossible. Because the man is still pointing. Beside Tobias in seat 2B, his mother sits with her spine straight and her chin level and her hands flat on the tray table. Her name is Renata Haynes. She is 34 years old, and she is the most composed person in the forward cabin by a considerable margin, and it is costing her more than anyone watching can calculate. She says quietly, "My son is in the correct seat. We are both in the correct seats." Donald Price says, "I'm not talking about the seat number. I'm talking about who is in it." Lindsay, the flight attendant, says, "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice." Donald says, "I want to speak to the pilot. Immediately. I want the pilot to come out here and deal with this because clearly the crew is not capable of handling it." His voice fills the aisle. It fills the first 4 rows. It goes through the curtain that separates first class from economy and lands in the ears of the passengers in the first economy rows who crane slightly forward to understand what is happening up front. And Tobias sits in seat 2C and does not flinch. His hands are in his lap. His eyes are forward. He is still. Then a voice comes from behind the curtain. A voice that is calm and measured and carries the specific authority of someone who is accustomed to speaking in situations where being heard is not optional. The voice says, "Is there a problem here?" The curtain opens. The man who steps through is in a white uniform with 4 gold stripes on the epaulette and a captain's hat under his arm, and the bearing of someone who has spent 20 years in cockpits, 20 years of decisions that could not be wrong, 20 years of absolute responsibility for everything and everyone inside a pressurized tube at altitude. He is a tall man, lean, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and he looks at Donald Price with an expression that is completely professional and completely immovable, and then he turns to look at the boy's mother. And his face changes. Not dramatically. Not in the theatrical way that changes happen in stories. In the specific, involuntary way that faces change when they encounter something they were not prepared to encounter, when recognition arrives before the brain has had time to compose the appropriate expression and the true reaction gets through before the performance can be deployed. He says one word. He says, Renata. The first-class cabin does not understand what has just happened. The man in the aisle does not understand. Lindsay, the flight attendant, does not understand. But something has shifted. Something has changed in the temperature of the moment, in the weight and direction of it, shifted the way weight shifts when you move the fulcrum, when what was balanced on one side suddenly tips, irreversibly, toward the other. The entire plane is about to learn why. But first we have to go back to this morning, and to the story of how a woman named Renata Haynes and her son Tobias came to be sitting in seats 2B and 2C on Flight 884. Because that story, the real story, the one underneath the one that Donald Price thought he understood, is the story that is going to change every person on this aircraft before the wheels leave the ground. Subscribe right now and ring that bell. The pilot said one word and everything shifted. You need to be here when the full truth comes out. This story only gets more powerful from here. Comment below. The pilot walked out and said one word, Renata, and the whole cabin felt it. What do you think the history is between them? Drop your prediction right now. Act 2. Meet Tobias and Renata Haynes. Who they are before anyone on this plane decides for them. Renata Haynes is 34 years old, and she grew up in Beaumont, Texas, the only child of a woman who cleaned houses and a man who drove long-haul freight and who was, by the measurement of his presence at home, more a voice on the phone than a figure in the room. This is not a story of neglect. Her father was a good man who worked himself in the service of a family he rarely saw, who called every night from wherever the freight had taken him, and who came home on weekends when the schedule allowed, and who, when he was home, was fully home. But his absence was structural, built into the economics of their life, and Renata grew up with a clear understanding of what sacrifice looked like from the inside, what it cost, and what it built. It built her. She was quiet the way children who spend a lot of time with adults become quiet, not socially, not in the way that isolation produces quietness, but in the observational way. She listened more than she spoke. She absorbed rooms. She learned early to read the subtext beneath the text of what people said and did, to hear what was really meant behind the words that were used, to see the motivations behind the actions that people performed. This skill, developed in childhood from the close observation of adult life, became the foundation of everything she was professionally and personally useful for as an adult. She studied nursing. She wanted to be useful in the most direct and physical sense, to be the person in the room when someone needed help that no amount of money or intelligence could substitute for. She got her RN license from a school in Beaumont that she put herself through on financial aid and 2 part-time jobs, and she graduated and began working at a regional hospital and discovered, almost immediately, that she was gifted at the part of nursing that cannot be taught from a textbook, the part that happens between the technical interventions, the sitting with people, the listening, the specific, practical kindness of being present with someone in the worst moments of their life without making those moments about yourself. She has been a nurse for 11 years. She is now a charge nurse in a cardiac care unit in Houston, which means she has spent 11 years in the proximity of people whose hearts are failing them, and she has learned from those people, from their fear and their courage, and their conversations in the middle of the night when the ward is quiet, more about what matters than most people learn in a lifetime. She is raising Tobias alone. His father, a man she loved, a man she married at 24 with the specific hope of someone who has waited for the right person and believes she has found him, died when Tobias was 18 months old. A car accident on a Tuesday morning in January. Ordinary Tuesday. Nobody saw it coming. The kind of loss that has no narrative logic, no cause and effect that can be traced back to a decision, no lesson that makes the geometry of the grief instructive. Just a Tuesday, and then everything after. She does not talk about this to most people. Not because she is hiding it, because it is hers, and she has made peace with it in the interior way that certain losses require, and she does not need it to be visible to be real. Tobias knows his father from photographs and from the stories Renata tells him, stories she has curated for what they give him, for what they show him about who he came from, about what his father found funny, and what his father admired, and what his father believed about the kind of person worth being. Tobias has grown up from these stories, with a father who is in some ways more fully present than fathers who are physically there, but absent in the ways that matter. He has a father who is all the best parts, preserved in amber, given to him story by story over 10 years of bedtimes and car rides and kitchen table conversations. He looks like his father. Renata has never told him this in so many words. She tells him in the specific way she looks at him sometimes, the way that contains something she doesn't say, but that Tobias has always been able to feel. He is 10 years old, and he is the particular kind of child that grows from a particular kind of upbringing. The upbringing of a parent who has lost something enormous and who has decided, deliberately and at significant personal cost, not to let that loss become the organizing principle of their child's life. He is curious and he is warm, and he is, in the specific way of children who have been genuinely seen and genuinely listened to, secure. Not naive. Renata has not raised him naive, but rooted, grounded in a sense of his own value that does not depend on rooms approving of him. He loves his mother with a fierce, practical specificity of a child who has understood, from early, that she is doing something extraordinary. He helps. He pays attention. He tells her, when she is tired in the way that Tuesday January tired can resurface in unexpected seasons, that she is doing great. He says it with the solemn, absolute sincerity of someone for whom it is simply true and who needs her to know that he knows. And he loves airplanes. He has loved airplanes since Renata first explained to him, when he was 5 and they were watching a documentary about the Wright brothers, that flight was not magic, that it was physics, and the physics were understandable, and that human beings had figured them out from scratch and built machines to apply them and changed the world by doing so. He latched onto this information with the specific hunger of a child for whom understanding how things work is not an academic exercise, but a physical need. He wanted to understand everything about aircraft, the lift and the drag, the engine systems, the navigation, the communication between pilots and air traffic control. He wanted to understand all of it, and he was on the road to understanding all of it, one library book and one YouTube video and one question to Renata at a time. One day he is going to fly them. He has told his mother this. She has not expressed doubt. She has done what she always does with his certainties, received them as information, filed them under true, and begun thinking about how to help him get there. This trip is part of how. Subscribe. The story of how Renata got these first-class tickets is coming next, and when you hear it, it changes everything you understand about what kindness comes back really means. Renata raised Tobias so that his security doesn't depend on rooms approving of him. Comment. Who raised you that way? Or, who do you wish had? Act 3. The journey to the airport. The morning, the tickets, and what kindness looks like when it returns. The day started early the way days that matter always start, before the alarm, in the dark, with the mind already running. Renata was awake at 5. Not from anxiety. She had been preparing for this trip for 2 weeks, and the preparation was thorough. She was awake because she was Renata Haynes, and she had learned, after 11 years of night shifts in a cardiac ward, that her body had developed its own relationship with sleep, and that relationship did not always prioritize her preferences. She lay in the dark for 20 minutes and thought about the day ahead, running it through with the practiced precision of a nurse reviewing a care plan, each element in sequence, each potential complication identified and routed around. The trip to Chicago was for Tobias. Specifically, it was for the Aerospace Explorers Junior Program, a 3-day youth aviation event hosted annually by the Greater Chicago Aviation Association, in partnership with several commercial carriers and the Federal Aviation Administration's Education Division. The program took 40 students between the ages of 9 and 14 from across the country and gave them 3 days of intensive, hands-on aviation education, simulator time, classroom instruction from active commercial pilots and engineers, a tour of the operations center at O'Hare, a session with an air traffic controller, A panel discussion with women and men who had built careers in aerospace. Tobias had applied in April. The application required a one-page essay on why aviation mattered to him. He wrote a draft, revised it, showed it to Renata, listened to her edits, revised it again, and submitted it with the careful formality of someone who understood that this was not a class assignment, but a real document going to real people who would use it to make a real decision. He was accepted in June. He read the acceptance letter 3 times before putting it down, then picked it up and read it again.
He said, "Mom."
She said, "I know." He said, "I got in." She said, "You did." He said, "I actually got in." She said, "I know, baby.
I know."
He set the letter on the table. He picked up his fork and continued eating his dinner as though the past 30 seconds had not happened, but his face, the trying to be normal face of someone trying not to show how enormously something has landed, gave him completely away, and Renata looked at that face and felt, somewhere in her chest, something that she did not have a precise name for, but that was adjacent to the feeling she had in the hospital when a patient who had been critical stabilized. The feeling of a thing holding. The tickets. The tickets were the story inside the story. Renata had booked economy. Of course she had booked economy. Economy was the ticket she could afford without adjusting anything in the monthly budget, which was engineered to a precision that left small margins and no room for luxuries. She had booked economy in April, on the same day she submitted Tobias's application, in the specific hope and preparation combination that she had been practicing his entire life. Act as though it will happen before you know it will happen, so that when it happens, you are already moving. She had booked 2 economy seats, Charlotte to Chicago. Houston to Chicago. She had printed the confirmation. She had put it in the travel folder. And then, 2 weeks ago, she had received an email. The email was from the airline's customer relations department. It told her that her booking had been reviewed as part of the airline's loyalty appreciation program, which recognized passengers who had received poor service experiences on previous flights and provided service corrections as a gesture of goodwill. It informed her that her economy booking had been upgraded to first class at no additional charge for both passengers on her reservation. She read the email twice. She checked the booking reference. She called the airline's customer service line to confirm because she was Renata Haynes, and she confirmed things. It was real. She told Tobias that evening. She showed him the confirmation. He looked at it carefully and then looked at her and said, "First class?" She said, "First class." He said, "Like up at the front?" She said, "Like up at the front." He said, "How?" She thought about it for a moment, about the true answer, which was that it came from a complaint she had filed 8 months ago after a flight on which the service had been, in a precise and documented way, inadequate, and from an airline system that had flagged her loyalty record and generated this correction. But the true answer was also something else. She said, "Sometimes kindness comes back when you least expect it." He looked at her with those eyes that always seemed to be listening to the thing underneath the thing. He said, "Is that actually what happened?" She smiled. She said, "It's part of what happened." He nodded, accepting the partial answer with the equanimity of a child who has learned that his mother tells him what she tells him for good reasons, and that the parts she withholds are not deceptions, but distances he will close when he is ready to cross them. The morning of the flight, they moved through their routine with the focused ease of 2 people who have traveled together enough to have a system. Bags packed the night before. Clothes set out. Early enough to be unhurried. Tobias was dressed and ready before Renata, as he always was when something important was happening, because he prepared himself early as a form of commitment, as though being ready in his body made him more ready everywhere else. In the rideshare to the airport, Tobias watched Houston pass outside the window in the morning light. The freeways, the exits, the office parks and strip malls, and the distant geometry of the city center, and he said, not to her specifically, but into the air of the car, "I'm going to remember this morning." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because this is the morning before something that's going to matter. And I want to remember what it felt like before I knew how it was going to go." She looked at him. Sometimes he said things that were so far past what she expected that she needed a moment to catch up. She said, "Okay, what does it feel like?" He said, "Like the right kind of nervous. Like the kind that means something good is coming." She held that sentence for the rest of the ride. She held it through check-in and security and the long walk to the gate, and she held it still when the gate agent called first-class boarding and her son stood up with his backpack and his boarding pass and walked toward the jetway with the quiet, composed excitement of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and is finally, exactly on his way. Subscribe and hit the bell. We're boarding the plane in the next act, and the man who is going to make this morning very difficult is already in his seat. Don't miss a moment of what's coming. Tobias said, I want to remember what it felt like before I knew how it was going to go. Comment. Can you remember a morning like that? A before something moment you've held on to?
Tell us.
Act 4. Boarding the plane. First class, first impressions, and the man who is already watching. Tobias stepped through the aircraft door and stopped. Not for long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. The length of time it took him to do what he always did when he entered a new aircraft for the first time, which was to read it. To absorb the layout, the dimensions, the configuration of the forward cabin against his knowledge of what this aircraft type should look like from the inside. He had studied this. He knew the seat configuration of most major commercial aircraft types from diagrams and photographs and the websites devoted to the topic that he had spent considerable hours on. Knowing what the diagram looked like was one thing. Being inside it was something else, and he wanted to register that difference. Then he walked to row 2. He found 2C. He put his backpack in the overhead bin with the careful, precise motion of someone who had looked up the correct way to stow a bag in an overhead bin and was applying that knowledge. He sat down. He fastened his seatbelt. He adjusted it. He looked at the seat back pocket and inventoried the contents: safety card, in-flight magazine, air sickness bag, the earphone sleeve. He removed the safety card and read it with complete, sincere attention, beginning to end, the way it is meant to be read, and almost never is. Renata settled into 2B. She watched him read the safety card. She had the particular feeling that came over her sometimes when she watched him engage with the world, the feeling of something she had built operating at its full capacity. Not pride exactly, because pride had a quality of ownership in it that didn't quite fit. Something closer to wonder. The specific wonder of watching a person be entirely themselves. The boarding process continued around them. First class filled gradually. A businesswoman in a dark suit taking 1A, an older gentleman settling into 1B with the unhurried ease of someone for whom first-class boarding is unremarkable. A couple in 3A and 3B who looked like they might be celebrating something. A man in a window seat across the aisle who immediately reclined and closed his eyes. And then Donald Price. He came down the jetway with the particular authority of a man who believes he moves through spaces, and the spaces reorganize around him. He had a rolling carry-on that he had not checked despite the fact that it was at the very edge of allowable carry-on dimensions, and he handled the boarding pass scanner with the practiced impatience of someone for whom the security process is an inconvenience they are required to tolerate. He was in 2A, the window seat. He put his carry-on in the overhead bin, handling it with the casual authority of a man who considers overhead bins to be organized in descending order of entitlement. He sat. He adjusted his jacket. He looked at his phone. He looked at the seat back pocket. He looked at Tobias. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then it moved to Renata. Then back to Tobias. Then it did the thing that looks do when they are carrying a hypothesis. It moved between the evidence and the conclusion, checking whether the evidence supports what the conclusion wants to be. Donald Price had a conclusion. He had assembled it in 3 seconds, from the evidence of his eyes, and he was checking it. His conclusion was wrong. It was wrong in the most complete and fundamental sense available. Not wrong about a detail or a fact or a specific error of information, but wrong about the nature of what he was looking at. Wrong in the way that you can be wrong when your system for evaluating the world has been built from assumptions rather than observation, when the categories you used to sort people were given to you by an environment that had already decided what the categories meant and who belonged in which. He did not know he was wrong. Men who are wrong in this way rarely do. Their wrongness has been so consistently confirmed by the rooms they've been in, the circles they've moved through, the choices they've made about where to go and who to be with, that it does not feel like error. It feels like perception. It feels like simply seeing what is there. He returned to his phone. Tobias looked out the window at the Houston tarmac. He was watching a ground crew finish the baggage loading operation on the aircraft next to theirs, watching the way the crew coordinated, the specific hand signals, the organized system of it. He was thinking about what it would be like to understand the full operational picture of an airport, not just the flying part, but all of it, the ground operations and the tower communications, and the logistics that made the whole thing work. He was not thinking about the man in 2A. He was thinking about what he loved. Renata was aware of Donald Price the way she was always aware of certain presences in certain spaces, the background radiation awareness that certain women develop in certain rooms, the awareness that something is in the atmosphere that requires attention, that the weather is changing, that the pressure is dropping. She kept her attention on Tobias and on her own thoughts and on the boarding process completing around them. She kept her hands easy in her lap. She breathed. The last few passengers boarded. The flight attendants completed their checks.
The door closed.
And Donald Price put his phone in his pocket and looked at row 2 with the expression of a man who has just made a decision. Subscribe in the next act. Donald Price starts talking. At first quiet, then not quiet at all. And every word is going to make what the pilot says later land even harder. Tobias read the safety card all the way through, something almost nobody does. Comment. What does it tell you about a person when they take seriously the things others dismiss? Act 5. The tension begins. First the comments. Then the questions. Then something darker. The plane was still at the gate when Donald Price said the first thing. He said it to Lindsay, who had stopped at row 2 to conduct the pre-departure check of the forward section. He said it with a friendly, reasonable tone, the tone of a man who is raising a concern that he considers entirely legitimate and who expects the reasonable person he is speaking to share his assessment of its legitimacy. He said, "Just want to make sure I'm understanding the seating correctly." He gestured toward Tobias, without looking at Tobias directly. He said, "Are these tickets part of the standard first-class allocation? Or is this some kind of upgrade situation?" Lindsay looked at her tablet. She said, "All passengers in the first-class cabin have confirmed first-class bookings, sir." He said, Right. I just want to be sure. Because I fly this route regularly, and the cabin is usually," he paused, sorting through his vocabulary for the word that would carry what he meant without saying what he meant, usually configured a certain way. He said it with the air of someone describing an aesthetic preference. Lindsay said, "Is there anything specific I can help you with, sir?"
He said, "No."
Just noting it. He returned to his phone. Tobias was looking out the window. He had not turned from the window during the exchange. Whether he had heard it, and he had heard it because he heard everything, he gave nothing away. Renata had heard it. She catalogued it the way she catalogued these things, filed under, noted, to be monitored, not yet requiring action. She had a threshold. She had been operating with a threshold her entire life. She knew where it was and she knew how to hold to it, and she knew from experience that acting before it was reached rarely served her, and often cost more than it was worth. The plane pushed back. Taxied. The engines rose. The runway aligned. Tobias pressed slightly forward in his seat during the takeoff roll, as though leaning into it. Renata watched the side of his face. She watched his expression as the speed built and the nose lifted and the ground fell away, the particular, private expression of a child experiencing something they love at full intensity. Not performed. Not for her benefit. Just real. She thought, whatever happens today, this moment has already happened, and it belongs to him, and nobody can reach back and take it. They leveled off at cruising altitude. Donald Price put his tray table down. He ordered bourbon from Lindsay, who brought it promptly. He looked at his phone for 15 minutes. Then he looked at the cabin. His eyes moved to Tobias, who was now writing something in the small notebook he had brought, a notebook that Renata had given him specifically for the trip and which he had begun filling with observations and questions since they left the house that morning. He was writing about the takeoff, about what he had felt and estimated and observed. He was being Tobias. Donald said, to no one specifically, but at a volume that carried to the adjacent seats, "I remember when this section meant something." He said it with the particular nostalgic quality of a man mourning a version of the world that served his preferences, a version whose passing he attributes to a general decline in standards rather than to the expansion of access to spaces that were previously withheld. The woman in 1A looked up from her laptop. She looked at Donald. She returned to her laptop. The older gentleman in 1B had heard. He looked at the seat back in front of him with the specific expression of someone who is deciding whether this is the moment to say something, running the calculation of cost and outcome, arriving at a conclusion he was not fully satisfied with. Tobias looked up from his notebook. He looked at Donald Price for 3 seconds. He looked back at his notebook. He wrote, in his careful handwriting, "The man next to the window is trying to make us uncomfortable." He underlined the word trying. He returned the pen to the notebook. He turned back to the window and watched the clouds. Subscribe, the escalation is about to go fully public. What Donald does next involves standing up and pointing, and the entire first-class cabin is about to witness it.
Be here.
Tobias wrote, "The man next to the window is trying to make us uncomfortable," and underlined trying. Comment. What do you think the underlining means? What was he telling himself? Act 6. Public humiliation. The moment he stands up, and the entire cabin hears it. The drink service had just finished when Donald Price stood up. He stood up with the deliberate, committed motion of a man who has been building towards standing up since the plane leveled off, and who has now decided that the building is finished, and the time for action has arrived. He turned toward the aisle. He placed his hand on the seat back. He said, "I need to speak to a flight attendant." He said it at a volume that was not a request. It was the volume of an announcement. Lindsay was near the galley. She came quickly because the volume indicated urgency. Donald said, "I've been patient about this, but I need it addressed now." He looked at Tobias. He looked at Lindsay. He said, "This is first class." He said it the way people say things that they are using as shorthand for a longer argument they have decided not to bother making because they believe the shorthand is sufficient. As though the words first class contained, inside them, everything that needed to be communicated about who belonged in it. He said, "He shouldn't be sitting here." The cabin went quiet. Not the gradual quiet of a room winding down. The immediate quiet of a shock absorber. The sudden, collective inhalation of 8 people receiving information that they needed a moment to process. The woman in 1A looked up from her laptop and did not look back down. The older gentleman in 1B turned in his seat. The couple in 3A and 3B, who had been talking quietly, stopped talking. Lindsay said, "Sir, I need you to lower your voice." She said it with the professional composure of someone who has been trained for exactly this kind of situation, and who is applying the training with full effort. She said, "This is a confirmed first-class booking." Donald said, "I don't care about the booking. I care about the standards of this cabin." He said, "People like him don't belong here." He said it with the complete, unself-conscious conviction of a man who has never, in 51 years of saying things like this, had anyone in the room contest it in a way that reached him. Tobias looked down at his notebook. He did not flinch. He did not cry. He looked down at his notebook and he was very still, and he held, in his 10-year-old body, the weight of words that had been designed by their speaker to diminish him, to reduce him, in the hearing, to a category rather than a person, to something that could be assessed and dismissed without the inconvenience of knowing anything about him. He held the weight of them, and he did not collapse under it. Because he had been given by the person beside him, the equipment to hold this kind of weight without collapsing had been given it deliberately over 10 years, in the form of 100 small lessons about who he was and what he was worth and what other people's limitations said about them, and not about him. The equipment held. Renata turned to Donald Price. She looked at him with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely serious, and that had in it none of the flinching or the wavering or the accelerated breathing that would have told him he had caused the effect he was intending to cause. She said, "My son has a confirmed first-class ticket. He is 10 years old. He is on his way to a national aviation education program in Chicago for which he was competitively selected. He has done nothing wrong, and he has every right to be in this seat. And you, sir, are choosing to say, in a cabin full of witnesses, that he doesn't belong here based on nothing more than how he looks." She let the sentence land. She said, "I'd like to think about what that says. About you." Donald Price opened his mouth. He said, "I want to speak to the pilot." He said it the way people who have run out of arguments and have not run out of stubbornness say the thing they say next, which is to escalate to a higher authority in the hope that the higher authority will have access to a logic that their own position lacks. He said, I want the pilot to come out here and deal with this because clearly the crew is not capable of handling it. Lindsay said, Sir, I'll need to contact the flight deck. Tobias looked up from his notebook. He looked at his mother. Her expression was still composed, still level. But he saw what he always saw when he looked closely, the specific, invisible cost of the composure, the layer just beneath the surface where the weight of all of this lived. He saw his mother carrying something heavy and doing it so well that it looked like nothing. He set his notebook down. He sat up straight. He had something to say. Subscribe. Tobias is about to speak, and what he says is going to stop that cabin cold. You need to hear every word of it. Renata told Donald, I'd like to think about what that says about you. Comment. Have you ever delivered a response like that? Calm, direct, and completely devastating? What happened? Act 7. The boy's courage. Tobias speaks, and the cabin listens in a different way. He said, May I say something? He said it to Donald Price directly. Not to Lindsay, not to his mother, not to the cabin at large. To the man who had been speaking about him as though he were not there, as though he were a problem to be solved rather than a person in a seat. He said it with the formal courtesy that Renata had taught him was the correct register for addressing adults in situations of conflict, not aggressive, not pleading, the specific register of a person who intends to be taken seriously and who has decided that the way to communicate that intention is to speak as though it is already true. Donald Price looked at him. Something in the directness of the request, the calm specificity of may I say something, delivered at 10 years old, in this situation, created a moment of genuine hesitation. He said, Go ahead. Tobias said, My name is Tobias Haynes. I'm 10 years old. I'm going to Chicago for the Aerospace Explorers Junior program, which I applied to in April and was accepted to in June. My mom booked these tickets through the airline, and they were upgraded to first class through the airline's own loyalty program. We have done nothing wrong, and we have every right to be here. He paused. He was not done. He said, My mom is a cardiac care nurse. She works night shifts. She has worked night shifts for 11 years, including during the years when I was small, and she had to find someone to stay with me so she could go and take care of other people's families. She has worked for the money that makes our life possible, and she has never once, in all of that, made me feel like I was a burden to it. She is the best person I know. His voice was completely steady. He was not performing steadiness. He was steady the way his mother was steady, from the inside out, from the place that steadiness lives when it has been built from something real. He said, She got these seats because the airline believed she deserved them. And I think the airline was right. And I think that what you have been saying since we sat down about her and about me is wrong. Not as an opinion, as a fact. The first-class cabin of Flight 884 was so quiet that the ambient sound of the aircraft, the engine hum, the air circulation, the small creak of the fuselage, was fully audible. The woman in 1A had closed her laptop. She was looking at Tobias. The older gentleman in 1B had turned around completely. The couple in 3A and 3B were perfectly still. Tobias said, looking directly at Donald, You said people like him don't belong here. I want to ask you something. He said it simply, not aggressively, with genuine curiosity. He said, What are people like me? What do you actually know about me that makes you think that? Donald Price had no answer. He had many things, 51 years of accumulated justifications, the comfortable vocabulary of a man who has always moved through a world that confirmed his categories. But in this specific moment, confronted with this specific question, asked by this specific child who is looking at him with the direct, patient, completely unafraid attention of someone who had already decided that whatever the answer was, it would not diminish him. Donald Price had nothing. He said, I want to speak to the pilot. He had said this before. He said it again now because it was the only escalation available to him, the only remaining move in the direction he had committed to, and he was not, despite everything, ready to turn around. Lindsay had already gone to the interphone. Subscribe right now. The pilot is walking out of that cockpit in the next act, and when he sees Renata, The whole story is going to open up into something none of these passengers saw coming. Tobias asked, "What are people like me? What do you actually know about me?" Comment. What do you think is the most powerful question a person can ask someone who has prejudged them? Act 8. The pilot appears. 4 gold stripes, a changed face, and 1 word. Captain Marcus Webb had been in the cockpit for 2 hours and 17 minutes when the interphone call came from Lindsay. He listened. He asked 2 questions. He thanked her. He sat for 30 seconds. Then he stood up. His first officer, a young woman named Captain Elaine Souza, who had been flying with him for 6 months and who had developed, in those 6 months, a reliable ability to read his face as a flight instrument of its own kind, looked at him. She said, "You're going out there?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Is that?" She thought about it. She said, "Is that standard?" He said, "No." He put on his jacket. He picked up his hat. He said, "I'll be brief." He went through the cockpit door. Captain Marcus Webb was 43 years old, and he had been flying commercial aviation for 15 years, and before that he had been flying everything that would have him: crop dusters, charter flights, flight instruction, the whole spectrum of ways to build hours when you are a young man from a modest background in Corpus Christi, Texas, who has decided that the sky is not optional, that the sky is the destination, and that you will find a way to get there regardless of what the way costs. He was a large presence in an aisle. Not aggressive, he did not have the quality of a man who used his size as a tool, but absolute. The quality of someone who has spent 20 years in a position of complete responsibility and who has become, in that time, the kind of person that responsibility makes. Someone who does not hurry and does not flinch and does not need the room to tell him he belongs in it. He walked down the aisle of the first-class cabin. The cabin rearranged its attention around him. 8 passengers who had already been paying close attention now paid closer attention. Donald Price, who was still standing, straightened further. The reflex straightening of a man who has been demanding the appearance of authority and who is now, for the first time, confronted with the actual thing. Captain Webb looked at Donald Price with a calm, steady, direct attention. He said, "You wanted to speak with me?" Donald said, "Yes." He said, "There is a situation in this cabin that your crew has not been able to handle." He said, "These passengers," he gestured at row 2, "should not be in this section. This is a first-class cabin, and there has clearly been some kind of error." Captain Webb said, "I've been briefed on the situation." Donald said, "Then you understand." Captain Webb said, "I understand that you have been loudly and publicly expressing the belief that a child and his mother should be removed from confirmed seats based on your assessment of their appearance." He said it with the complete, quiet, factual composure of someone who is naming a thing precisely and without heat, because the precision is sufficient and the heat is unnecessary. Donald Price opened his mouth, and Captain Marcus Webb turned toward row 2. He turned toward the boy and his mother, and his expression in that moment, the expression he turned on them before his professional composure could catch up with his recognition, was not a captain's expression. It was a person's expression, the expression of someone encountering, without warning, a face they have thought about often, in the specific way that certain faces stay with you because of what they were attached to, because of what was happening in your life when they appeared. He said, "Renata." Just the one word. Her name. In the voice of someone for whom the name contained a great deal more than a name usually contains. Renata Haynes looked up at Captain Marcus Webb. Her expression moved through recognition, and then through something behind recognition, something larger, something that combined surprise and warmth and the particular, complex emotion of seeing someone you did something for years ago, in a moment you remember better than they might know you remember it. The entire cabin was watching. Nobody spoke. Tobias was looking from the captain to his mother and back, running the calculation of the exchange with the rapid observational intelligence that was entirely his own. He said quietly to his mother, "Mom, do you know him?" She looked at her son. Then she looked at Captain Marcus Webb. She said, "Yes." She said it softly. She said, "I knew him a long time ago." Subscribe. The next act is the story. The real story. What happened years ago between Marcus Webb and Renata Haynes, and what it means for every person standing in that aisle right now. The pilot said one word, her name, and the whole cabin felt it. Comment. Has a single word ever changed the atmosphere of a room you were in? What was the word? Act 9. The Hidden Past. 13 years ago, the story that changes everything. Captain Marcus Webb looked at the cabin. He looked at the passengers who were watching, the woman in 1A, the older gentleman in 1B, the couple in 3A and 3B, the man across the aisle, Lindsay standing near the galley. He looked at Donald Price, who was still technically standing in the aisle, though his standing had lost the quality it had 10 minutes ago, had gone from the stance of a man pressing forward to the stance of a man who is no longer certain about the direction of forward. Captain Webb said, "I'd like to tell you all something." He said it at the measured, carrying volume of a man who is accustomed to being listened to and who has something worth saying. He said, "I've been asked to address a complaint about these passengers. Instead, I'm going to tell you who they are." He paused. The kind of pause that a person takes when they are about to say something that matters and want to give it the space it deserves. He said, 13 years ago, I was 29 years old. I was in my second year of flight school at a program in San Antonio. He said it with the even, factual delivery of someone reporting events they have reviewed many times in memory and have learned to describe, without the tremor that was originally in them. He said, I was on scholarship, but the scholarship covered tuition and not everything else. Housing,
Food.
transportation to the flight line, the costs that the scholarship language doesn't include. He said, I was 3 weeks from the end of the semester. I needed $1,200. I had $400. Without the $1,200, I couldn't complete the training hours for that semester. I would have had to withdraw. And if I withdrew, I would have lost the scholarship because the scholarship had an enrollment continuity requirement. If I lost the scholarship, I was done. There was no version of my financial situation at 29 that would have allowed me to come back. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the oval windows, the sky was the color of deep, clear water. He said, I was sitting in the lobby of the flight school on a Wednesday afternoon. I had my laptop open, and I was looking at the financial aid portal, and I was doing the mathematics of something that had no good solution. A woman sat down near me. He said, I don't know why she sat there. There were empty chairs. She chose the one near mine. He said, she didn't know me. I didn't know her. She was there, I found out later, visiting a friend who worked at the school. She was a nurse who was on a day off and had come to the city to see a friend. He looked at Renata. He said, she asked me if I was all right. I said yes. The way people say yes when the honest answer is something much larger than the space they're in feels safe to hold it. She said, you don't look like you're all right. He said, I told her I was figuring something out. He said, she sat there for a while. Then she said, and I remember the exact words. I've remembered them for 13 years. She said, is there anything I can do to help? The cabin was absolutely still. He said, I told her what the situation was. I told her the number. I told her what would happen if I couldn't make it. He said, I'm not entirely sure why I told her. She had the quality of someone who was actually asking. Not asking the way people ask when they're being polite, and the expected answer is no. Actually asking. And I was 29 and I was desperate, and she was the first person in a long time who had looked at me in the middle of something hard and asked a real question. He said, she went to the ATM down the hall. She came back. She put $800 in my hand. In cash. She said, I don't have the whole $1,200. But I have this, and you can have it. He said, I told her I couldn't take it. She said, you can, and you should. She said, I'm a nurse. I believe in people making it through to the other side. Consider this medical.
He stopped.
He was a 43-year-old man with 20 years of aviation behind him and 4 gold stripes on his shoulder, and the bearing of someone who had been through things and come out the other side of them, and he stopped for a moment in the aisle of his own aircraft and let a memory that he had been carrying for 13 years move through his face. He said, I made it through the semester. I got a part-time job that covered the remaining $400. I kept the scholarship. I completed training. I got my commercial license. I flew charter for 3 years. I got hired by this airline 8 years ago. He said, I have flown in the years since that Wednesday afternoon in San Antonio, several hundred flights. I have carried, in those flights, hundreds of thousands of passengers. He looked at Renata. He looked at Tobias. He said, I have thought about that woman every day. He said, I never got her last name. I tried to find her. I wrote a letter to the flight school asking if they had a record of visitors that day. They didn't. I made peace, eventually, with the possibility that I might never find her. With the possibility that some things happen once and then live in you as the kind of thing you carry forward without knowing what became of the source. He said. Her name was Renata. He looked at the woman in seat 2B. He said, and this is her. The first-class cabin of Flight 884 held the truth of this for a long, full, extraordinary moment. Tobias was looking at his mother. He had never heard this story. She had never told him. Not the flight school, not the ATM, not the $800, not the stranger who became a pilot. She had not told him because she did not think of it as a story. She thought of it as a thing she did. A Wednesday afternoon thing, a there was a person who needed help thing, a what else would you do thing. He looked at her with the expression of a child who has just received a piece of his own origin story, who has just learned something about the person who made him that reshapes the picture he already had into something larger. She looked back at him. Her eyes were bright. She said, very quietly, I didn't know it was going to matter that much.
He said, Mom.
He said it the way children say mom when they mean something they don't have another word for. When the word itself has to carry more than it was built for. Subscribe, the next act is justice. Real justice. The kind that doesn't come from a system or a policy, but from the truth landing exactly where it needs to land. Don't miss a second. Renata gave $800 to a stranger in an airport because he needed it and she had it. Comment. Have you ever helped a stranger in a significant way, or had a stranger help you? Tell us what happened. Act 10. Justice and accountability. The pilot turns to Donald and says the thing that cannot be unsaid. Captain Marcus Webb turned to Donald Price. He turned with the unhurried, complete movement of a person who has something to say and who is not in a hurry to say it, because the weight of what he is about to say does not require speed. He looked at Donald Price with the direct, steady, entirely composed attention that 20 years of cockpit responsibility had built into him, the attention of a man who does not require the other person's cooperation in order to be clear. He said, You told this boy and his mother they don't belong here. He did not frame it as a question. He stated it. He stated it the way you state facts that have been witnessed by 8 people and that are not subject to revision. Donald Price said nothing. Captain Webb said, The woman you said doesn't belong in this cabin is the reason I'm standing here. He said it simply, without drama. The way a person states a fact that is extraordinary in its content but that is simply, cleanly, entirely true. He said, Without what she did on a Wednesday afternoon in San Antonio 13 years ago, I would not have completed flight training. I would not have my license. I would not have been hired by this airline. I would not be the person standing in front of you right now. He said, Everything I have built, every flight I have taken, every passenger I have carried safely from one city to another, all of it traces back to $800 from a stranger who didn't ask for anything in return and didn't know she was doing anything more than helping someone who needed help. He said, She belongs on this aircraft more than anyone else in this cabin, including me. Donald Price's expression had been undergoing a slow, visible dissolution for the past several minutes. The confidence that had been its primary feature, the forward-leaning, room-arranging confidence of a man who had decided before speaking that he was right and that the room would confirm it, had gone through several stages. First the hesitation when Tobias spoke. Then the realignment when the captain emerged. Then the arrival of the story, fact by fact, in the specific, cumulative way that facts arrive when they are delivered by someone who knows them from the inside. And now this. Now the direct address. Now the accounting. He had no response. The man who had been loud enough to fill a first-class cabin with his conviction stood in the aisle and was silent. His silence was not dignified. It was the silence of a position that has run out of ground to stand on, that has been walked back, step by step, by the simple, relentless advance of what was true. Captain Webb said, I want to be clear about something. He said it to the cabin, not just to Donald, because the cabin had witnessed all of it and the cabin was owed clarity. He said, On this aircraft, every passenger is treated with respect. Not because of what they can afford. Not because of what they look like. Not because of any category that someone else has assigned to them. Every passenger. He said, kindness and character decide what a person is. Not prejudice. Never prejudice. He looked at Donald. He said, I'm going to ask you to return to your seat. You are going to remain in your seat for the remainder of this flight without making any further comments to these passengers or to any other passenger in this cabin. If you are unable to do that, we will divert. He said, this is not a negotiation. Donald Price sat down. He sat with the specific quality of a man whose argument has been taken from him, not by force, not by shouting, but by truth arriving in a form that his machinery could not deflect. He sat and he looked at the seat back in front of him, and he was quiet, and whether the quiet was the beginning of understanding or simply the end of options was something that only he could know and that only time would determine. But he was quiet. The woman in 1A began to applaud. It started with her. Then the older gentleman in 1B joined, and then the couple in 3A and 3B, and then the other passengers in the forward section one by one, until the first-class cabin of Flight 884 from Houston to Chicago was full of the sound of people who had witnessed something and who needed to give the witnessing somewhere to go. Tobias looked at his mother. She was looking at Captain Marcus Webb. Her eyes were bright, and her chin was level, and her hands were still flat on the tray table, but the flatness of them had changed. They were not the careful, effortful flat of a woman holding herself together under pressure. They were the easy, natural flat of a woman who has set something down, who has been carrying something for the past hour and has, in this moment, found a place to put it. Subscribe. The ending is the most powerful part of this entire story. What the pilot says to Tobias before he goes back to the cockpit is something you're going to remember. Don't miss it. Captain Webb said, kindness and character decide what a person is, not prejudice. A comment. Has someone ever said something in a public space that you felt like the whole room needed to hear? What was it? Act 11. The emotional ending. What the captain said to the boy, and what the plane remembers. Captain Marcus Webb crouched down. It was the specific, deliberate act of a tall man choosing to be at a 10-year-old's eye level. Not bending slightly. Actually crouching, so that his face was level with Tobias's face, so that the conversation that was about to happen happened between equals and was not a dispensation from above. He said, "You're Tobias." Tobias said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Your mother has told me about you. In the last 5 minutes. In the way that she looked at you when I said your name, and I understood who you were." Tobias considered this. Captain Webb said, "Your mom tells me you love planes." Tobias said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I've been studying aviation for 4 years. Commercial systems, navigation, weather." He said, "I read accident investigation reports because they're the most honest documents in aviation. They don't pretend anything didn't happen." Captain Webb looked at him with the specific, complete attention of a person who is receiving information that adjusts their understanding. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How old are you?" 10, Tobias said. Captain Webb said, "I got my private license at 17. He said it as a reference point, not a comparison. He said, "I started reading accident reports at 12. He said, "You're already ahead of where I was." Tobias was very still. The kind of still that is not the still of not moving but the still of complete absorption. Every available resource redirected to receiving what is being said. Captain Webb said, "What are you most interested in?" "Of all of it." Tobias said, "The decision-making." He said, "Not the technical systems, those are learnable. The decision-making in adverse conditions. How pilots know what to do when multiple things are wrong at the same time and the checklist runs out." He said, "That's the part that interests me most." Captain Webb looked at him for a long moment. He said, "That's the right question." He said it the way a teacher says it when a student has asked the question that cuts to the center of the subject, not as praise but as recognition. The recognition of one person by another who's been in the same territory and understands the map. He said, "The program you're going to in Chicago, they're going to give you tools. Good ones. But the question you just asked, about decision-making in adverse conditions, that's the question you carry with you out of the program and into everything after. Don't let anyone replace it with a simpler question. It's the right one." Tobias nodded. He wrote something in his notebook. Captain Webb looked at what he was writing. He said, "What did you write?" Tobias said, "The right question is about decision-making in adverse conditions." He said, "I'm going to want to remember that that's what a captain told me." Captain Webb smiled. It was a full, real smile, the kind that doesn't require anything from the recipient, that comes from somewhere genuine and offers itself without a return requested. He said, "Tobias." He said, "If you love planes, and it sounds like you do," he said it with the certainty of someone who has just received more than sufficient evidence. He said, "One day I expect to see you flying one." He said, "And when I see your name on a manifest, I'm going to remember this flight." Tobias looked at him. He said, "I'm going to remember this flight too." He said it with the specific quality of someone making a commitment, not a hope, a commitment. The kind of thing you say when you intend to be held to it. Captain Webb stood. He looked at Renata. He said, "I've been wanting to say thank you for 13 years. She said, "You just did." He said, "It doesn't feel sufficient." She said, "It is. It really is." She said it with the quiet completeness of someone who means exactly what they say, for whom the economy of the phrase is itself the fullness of it. It is. It really is. She was not being gracious in the performed way. She was reporting. He looked at her for a moment. Then he straightened his jacket. He said, "To the cabin. Thank you all for your patience." He looked at Lindsay. He looked at Donald Price's seat back, briefly, with the expression of a man who has nothing further to say in that direction. He walked back up the aisle. He went through the curtain. The cockpit door opened and closed. From the back of the plane, through the curtain, the economy passengers who had been listening, who had assembled from sound and fragment and the carrying quality of a voice that didn't try to whisper, began to clap. Economy class, clapping for something happening in first class, which almost never happens on a flight, and which happened today. The first-class passengers joined. The applause moved through both sections and filled the aircraft the way sound fills a contained space, completely, without reservation. Tobias looked out the window. They were above the clouds. The sky at this altitude was the specific, impossible blue of high altitude, the blue that exists in the narrow band between the atmosphere and space, the blue that you can only see from up here, that most people on the ground have never seen, and that Tobias had been looking forward to since he first understood that this was where planes went. He said, "Mom." She said, "Yes?" He said, "You gave $800 to a stranger when you were how old?" She said, 21. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And now he's a pilot." She said, "And now he's a pilot." He said, "Because of you." She was quiet. She looked out the window. She said, "Because of him. I just gave him time." He said, $800 isn't time, Mom." She said, "It was for him." He looked at her. He looked at the sky. He said, "I'm going to do something like that someday." She said, "I know you are." He said, "I mean it." She said, "I know you do." She said, "That's why I know it." He looked at the high-altitude blue. He picked up his notebook. He wrote for a long time. He wrote what the captain had said, and what he himself had said, and what his mother had said, and the quality of the sky from up here, and the name of the wrong question, and the name of the right one, and the number 800, and the word Wednesday, and the specific, exact, particular way that a single ordinary act by a 21-year-old nurse in a flight school lobby had moved through time and arrived, 13 years later, at an aircraft aisle, at a captain in 4 stripes, at a boy in seat 2C with his notebook and his dream, and the high-altitude blue outside the window. He wrote all of it. He would want to remember it. All of it. The way it was before he knew how it was going to go. And the way it was after. This story is about many things. It is about a boy who did not flinch when a man with a loud voice decided, from nothing but appearance, that he did not belong. About a mother who held herself level under the weight of something that was designed to make her collapse. About a pilot who walked out of a cockpit because the only way to address what was happening was to address it directly, with the full weight of what he knew. But underneath all of those things, this story is about something smaller. A Wednesday afternoon. A lobby. A woman on a day off who sat near a stranger and asked a real question. Who went to an ATM and came back with what she had. who said, "I believe in people making it through to the other side," and said it with the full, clinical certainty of someone in whose hands people's lives had regularly been placed and who had learned from those people in those hands that making it to the other side was worth every resource available to help it happen. $800. $800, and the specific act of looking at a person in the middle of something hard and asking, genuinely, with the intention of hearing the answer, "Is there anything I can do?" From that, a pilot. From that pilot, hundreds of thousands of safe arrivals. From that act of kindness, returned in a way that no one could have planned and no one could have predicted, in an aisle at altitude, in front of a man who needed to learn something and a boy who needed to see it happen. From that, everything. The world runs, beneath the surface of every day, on acts like this. On the Renata Hayneses who don't think of what they do as significant, who think of it as simply responding to what is in front of them, who are the carriers of something they could not fully articulate but that moves through them into the world anyway and builds things in places they will never see. Until one day the thing they built walks down the aisle of their aircraft in 4 gold stripes and says their name. And everything comes back. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something that you want to hold on to, please subscribe, hit that like button, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Stories like this one deserve the widest possible audience. New stories every single week. Final question. What would you want to say to Renata Haynes, the 21-year-old who gave $800 to a stranger because he needed it? Leave your message in the comments. Every single one gets read because this community, like Renata, believes in people making it through to the other side.